Hey, so this tutorial is going to be a little bit more of a deep dive into mastering. We put out a mastering video quite a while back, and that one was literally just a crash course in mastering. Literally just want to just slap a couple of effects on and stick it on YouTube or SoundCloud or something, because you're not very used to mixing. It's maybe one of your first tracks that you've ever written, you're really new to composing and production, and you just want to get a track done and posted out there. This one is going to be a little bit more of a deep dive into mastering, a little bit more of a exploration of the processes, a few different options you can explore, and how to go into it in a little bit more depth. In order to do that, we're just going to use this track of mine here, which is one of my library music tracks. It's a garage rock track, and it's the kind of stuff that I get placed on TV and adverts. Titled here Garage Rock Idea 11. I think it ended up being called a track called Brick, but here you go. First things first, before you do any mastering, what you need to do, before you bounce it down, before you put any mastering on your main effects or anything, you just need to give your track a good listen, because this is the last chance you're going to get to notice any clips or ticks or things that shouldn't be there in your main mix. So what I suggest you do is, before you carry on, stop this video, go and listen through to your track and just listen to see if you're 100% satisfied. If there's no bits where things are coming in the wrong place, there's no bits that are way too loud, or bits that basically you're really happy with your final mix. The best way you can do it is, if you're happy out the speakers, stick some headphones in and really listen, concentrate. So put your phone away, don't have anything to distract you, and listen through your track from start to finish. The other thing I want you to do while you're doing that is pay attention to your faders. Make sure none of these black bits go into the plus. This is, of course, where your fader's set, minus 8.6, and the right hand side is the maximum value that your particular tracks get to. So none of these want to go into the orange or the red. If they do, turn them down and just make sure that it sits well in your mix, because otherwise it'll add distortion in there. Next thing, you can do this in one or two ways, your mastering. You can either do it in the project itself, or you can bounce your entire thing down and master it in a separate project file. I prefer doing it in the track where you've actually mixed it, because if there's any things that you need to tweak about your mix later on, it's much easier to do that in the actual track itself, rather than have to go back to your mix and mix it down again. Say you've got too much bass, or say you notice that there's something wrong with one of the instruments, then you have to go back to your mix, bounce it down again, then open it up in your mastering project again, and start the whole process over. I kind of like doing it like this, especially because if you notice there's anything, say there's too much bass in my track, I can actually go into my bass channel and try and fix it at the source, rather than do like a big broad EQ solving problem on my main mastering output. But there's literally no right or wrong way. If you want to bounce it down and approach it in a different track, that's perfectly fine, and some engineers work one way, some work the other. If you're going to work in your mix project, you need to select all of your channels, and instead of sending them straight to your stereo output, send them to a blank bus. I've chosen bus 7 here, so you literally, instead of stereo out, it'll usually say I've clicked bus 7 and sent it to this one here that had nothing on it, and you can see bus 7 here, stereo, and there's nothing on it. And what we're doing here is we're literally just using this, and I'm even going to rename it mastering bus, just so that's your main output level. And what I've done here is, going into your final output here, you want these to all be at 0. You don't want these to be less than 0 for your mastering. But what you want is that this signal here, in order to have a really good signal into some of these effects that we're going to put on here, needs to be about -6 is a good rule of thumb. Some people say a little bit less than that, -8, even less, or you can even have people that are quite happy to work at -4, -5. Let's just, a rule of thumb, something around -6, and if I press play, you'll see what I mean. It's a pretty loud part of the track, and it's -6.4, so that's pretty good. That's a pretty good level, and that's because I've just turned this down, and that's just what I'm going to use this channel for here. Then it goes to my main output here, and here's where we're going to put our mastering on. And you can see there's loads of effects that we're going to have a look at today. Some of these are ones that you should use, some of them are optional. The first thing that we're going to look at though is I'm going to stick our channel EQ on. Oh, in fact, before we do that, we're just going to do one final thing before we master, and it's to go back into our mix itself, and any audio files in our project here. I don't know if you've ever noticed this about your track, but sometimes when you chop audio files, and you can see that I've got lots of different takes here, it can create a little digital clip. And what that is sometimes if you chop a waveform in the middle of the wave there, you can see it's in the middle of a wave, the computer doesn't know what to do with that, and it creates like a little glitch sometimes. It can sound like a tiny little tick, and it's really annoying, and it's really frustrating if you don't know where those come from. And a really, really easy way of avoiding that and not even have to think about it with your mix as to whether the entire track has it or not is any audio that I've recorded or chopped around or used in any way, I draw a big box around it all, and I go over to here, and it'll have these 3 sections here. You click on the region one, and then this should usually be shrunken here, but it says more, so you click on the arrow, and then it's got this thing that says fade in and fade out. And what I've chosen here is I've just faded in by 3 milliseconds and fade it out by 3 milliseconds. It's got a asterisk because there's a little bit more of a fade out on these last ones here, but if you set it at 3 and 3, it'll just really, really quickly skate over that tiny little part that's causing the click, and the best ears in the world can't tell a little fading over 3 milliseconds. You won't be able to hear it, but what it'll do is get rid of those little clicks. So now you're happy with your mix, you've listened to it all the way through, you've just done that little quick cheat to get rid of those little clicks that I showed you, and you've sent it to a bus channel which you've turned down, so you've got about -6. You've got your mastering here on the end. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to stick a channel EQ on here, and it will look like this. The only thing I've done to start off with, because I don't particularly want to reach for loads of my EQ to start off with, but the first thing you do want to do is you want to do a low cut. So you click on that little one there, and a low cut cuts out all the frequencies below a certain point. And the reason you want to do this is because loads of speakers can't really go down to the 20-30 hertz range, and you can't really hear that much information, but in your track there might be a load of low rumble down there, and that affects the way that compressors and limiters and multipressors and all the other effects you're going to use work. So the easiest way to go about that is to stick on low pass, make it really narrow so it really drops off, and just set it about 25 or something like that, and it just rolls off all those bass frequencies underneath that, and it makes our mastering a lot easier later on. The rest of it, if you want to, you can boost anything here. I really wouldn't be reaching for anything that looks like this, so I wouldn't be going for any huge hills and troughs in your mixing on your mastering channel. You should literally be talking about a dB here or a dB there, if it needs it. Loads of my tracks, I'll be quite happy with the way I've mixed it, and some of the effects later on colour the sound. So what I'll do quite often is just leave the rest of this EQ and come back to it later if I need it. If you're really stuck, it does have like a little analyzer, and it's really good to use your ears, but if you get really stuck and you don't know what your frequencies look like, if you press play, you should see a nice little spectrum of all the frequencies in your tunes. Have a look. And that's looking fairly nice. The bass is a little bit louder than some of the bits further up, but it's fairly flattish. There's no huge bits that I need to be worried about, and I've really got a nice little spectrum in my mixing so far. So I'm just going to leave that, but I could come back to it later if I want to. The next 3 are completely optional, and you can use any of these. You can use some of them. You can even use all of them if you're really, really subtle about the way you do things. But the 3 things: number 1 is an exciter, number 1 is adding some saturation, and number 3 is putting it through an analog piece of equipment to get that real warm analog sound. And it's going to create different harmonic overtones, and it's going to sound very nice. First thing we're going to do is we're going to look at this thing, which is the exciter in Logic, and it's specialized. And what the exciter does is it adds some harmonic interest up the top end, and there's two different types of colors it kind of adds. I've chosen the second one. You can choose your frequency that it adds the extra harmonics up the top, and the further up you get, then the more the bottom frequencies are left alone. If you drag this all the way down, it's going to start adding some harmonic interest over the top. And then this is how much of it that we add. And the best way to do it is to kind of just play around with it, trying to find what sounds nice, and then just dial it back so it just sits nicely in your mix. I'll show you what I mean. And you can hear there when I turn it off and turn it back on. So set it about 5K. I've added about 20%, and you can just turn it off and on. Just have a listen to it again. And it sounds quite nice. It just brightens up that top end. The next thing you can do, and I'm going to turn this off. I'll show you the next one. The next one is a module in the Fat Effects, which is really cool. So if you've never used Fat Effects, it's just in multi-effects, and it looks quite confusing when you open it up. Let's recall the default setting. So when you have it as a default setting, it's got all these modules, and you can see that some of them are grayed out and some of them are yellow. That means they're on. Sorry about that there. What I want to do is I want to turn off all of these things apart from the distortion section. So I'm going to turn all of these off. I'm going to turn off the mastering, the limiting on the master channel. Just have it 100% and set my output at 0, because I don't want it to turn down the master of it at all. And on the distortion section, you've got a couple of different things. You've got Bit Crusher, which is going to absolutely compress the crap out of your track, which you don't want to have it really loud, because that sounds, well, if you want it to really deconstruct a track. There's a load of different ones on here that you can have. The one that I would really like to do is I'm going to turn this one down. I'm just going to have this one in the middle, which happens to be set to soft saturation. What saturation does is it just warms up those higher frequencies, kind of in a similar way to the exciter, and you tend to get similar effects. So I'm going to press play, and then I'm going to add some of that saturation in, and you'll hear the top end kind of come alive a bit. So again, it's really, really subtle effect, but it just kind of glues your mix together a little bit and adds like a really nice little bit on the top. If you're really careful, you can combine some of these things like the exciter and the saturator, but don't forget that if you've got a nice little effect that's nice and subtle, if you add another subtle effect on top, it kind of becomes less and less subtle the more you add. So let's just try those two together, see what it sounds like. And you'll notice that all of these effects are really, really subtle. They're really, really subtle what's happening here. And if you get really heavy-handed in your mixing, with your mastering, this is how you can destroy a really lovely mix. So we've got those two on there. These are optional. You can use them. You can not use them. It's completely up to you. And I really, really suggest you really give your track a good listen and don't automatically reach for these things. The third one you can put on here, which I really quite like, is that in Logic, in EQ, there's a section called Vintage EQs. And some of them say, I'm going to put it through this vintage tube EQ. And it will look like this, and it's a emulation of something called a Pultec EQ, which was a really lovely analog piece of equipment. And you can use it as an actual EQ, and you can boost your lows or your highs, or cut certain frequencies. And it's a really, really cool EQ here. But what you can actually do, if you don't want to use the EQ section of it, you can actually just use it and just drive the signal through it. And what it tries to do is it tries to emulate a signal going through a lovely analog old piece of equipment. And it has that nice little warmth on top of it that you get with analog equipment. And there's an output model, there's a silky one, there's a punchy one, and there's a smooth one. I'm going to try punchy just because it kind of sounds like it could fit the track that we've got going on here. And it's really, really subtle. The drive is usually set about 4, and I quite think that's a nice place to start. And if turn it on, I'm going to turn it off, and then I'm going to turn it on and see if you can hear the difference. And it really, really subtly kind of glues your mix together and creates some cohesion in your mix. And it's really subtle, but I hope you could hear that if you've got some headphones in. It sounded really quite nice. And if I turn all these 3 off, you'll really see the difference that this has made to it. Let's have a listen again. And it's starting to come together as a master here. The next thing I want to reach for is the multipressor. And the multipressor is a multi-band compressor. That's where the name comes from. And what it does is it compresses your frequency bands in 4 different compressors. And then what you can do with this, and I glossed over this last time because it's very complicated. There are some presets in here that you can muck around with. But if you wanted to play around with it yourself, there's a couple of important things that you can use this for. Number one is you can change the frequency bands. So this is going from 20 to, at the moment, 110. You can set it so you can get it to go further up or further down. You can boost or cut a particular frequency band, so it can help with your EQ. You can solo that particular band, so you can hear exactly what band it's compressing and what's happening to it. And the other thing is that you've got your compression here, and you can take it down to take your threshold down to your compressor, your compression working a bit harder. On the left, it's going to be our input signal. On the right, it's going to be our output signal. And we're just going to set the output at 0 for the time being. I'm going to press play and then go through these and just have a solo of each. See if we can get them sounding really nice, and then see if they can all sound really nice together, and then we'll do a bit of an A/B test to see what it's done to our mix. So there you go, that's sounding all right. And the last thing we wanted to stick on is an adaptive limiter. And usually what it'll come as settings wise is you set the gain down to 0, you set the output ceiling to minus 0.1, and you can leave all the rest. And this shows you our input, how much is going to reduce it by limiting wise, and the output here. And it should come up here. Basically the black, the amount of blackness you get in your fader is the amount of dynamics that you've got in your track. The less black you can see on your fader, the more squashed your track is. And you can afford to pump this if it's a little bit quiet coming out your multipressor here. And the aim is just to get it just squeezed a little bit, but the more you get this reduction happening, the more it's going to absolutely hammer the dynamic range of your track. So we're looking for a little bit of reduction here as the final little piece of the puzzle. In fact, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to turn up the signal coming out of our multipressor just to get it about 0. Right, let's go back here. And that's sounding pretty good. If I turn it all off and then turn it back on again, you'll hear the difference. It'll be huge. Right. And then finally, what you might want to do, and this is when you get into really advanced techniques, you can even muck around with sticking after that a loudness meter on here. And the loudness meter is just under metering. It's under loudness meter here. And what it does, it shows you the average loudness of your track. The one that you're really interested in is I, which is integrated. And it's good to have it towards minus 14. I think this is going to be a little bit hot when we press play. And the aim of this is the dynamic range on your track. If you absolutely hammer your multipressor and your limiter and you compress loads of your track, you're going to end up with this really squished signal, and it's going to end up with no dynamic range. And a good place to aim for is minus 14, because as soon as you start releasing stuff on Spotify and other streaming services, the average loudness that it works it out at is minus 14. So if your track is absolutely getting hammered on the dynamics and it's at minus 8, Spotify is just going to turn it down. So all the effort you've made to make your track sound as loud as possible, all it's going to do is just turn it down, and it's actually going to sound as if it's quieter, and it's going to lose all that dynamic range. So be really subtle with your multipressor and your limiter, and your loudness meter at the end can tell you what your little integrated signal should be. The last thing that you can do, and I can't really do it in this video without getting a copyright strike, is get a reference track. And a really good thing to do is get a copy of a mix of some band that's in a similar genre. I actually got a Royal Blood track, and now the problem is that if I press play and play a little bit of the Royal Blood track, I'm going to get copyright strikes on this video, so I don't want to do that. I'm just going to show you the waveform here. Now, I've ripped this off YouTube, and the problem with compressing with using reference tracks on YouTube is that they get compressed ridiculous amounts. So you can see that this is really fat and loads compressed and limited. And ripping tracks off YouTube is usually not a good idea. What is a good idea is if you can find a CD of a similar genre that you want to work with, you can go to some charity shops and buy one, or you can have a look around the internet and try and find some of the actual album tracks and load it up into your project. And don't forget to turn off the mastering when you're comparing. So turn off all the mastering and then press play on the reference track and see if that sounds pretty similar to yours. If the volume's kind of the same, if the dynamic range is kind of the same, if the EQ range is kind of the same. And if it really fits in with the genre, the loudness is working quite well, and it passes the ear test, then by all means get your track finished. When you finish, you click BNC to bounce it down. If you want to bounce it down as MP3, bounce it down as an MP3, but don't forget that by bouncing it down as MP3, it slightly compresses the signal, so it's not going to sound as crisp as it could do. But of course, this is what you need for loads of streaming services and that. The best possible quality is, of course, PCM, and when you send it off to places, they usually ask for WAV files or AIFF files, but you can put it on WAV. Usually 16-bit is usually what kind of CD quality is, and 44.1. I purely had it set as 24-bit because the company that I submit to likes stuff in 24-bit, and they also like it in 48K. But usually 16-bit and 44.1 is absolutely fine. Just before you do that, the last little thing that you should do your mastering is set your little loop, little box, the yellow box at the top, because that detects where it's going to bounce it from and to. And the absolute last thing that you want to do is on your main output, you click read. And if you click it, it should come up in now in Logic. There is a main fader for your output here, which there wasn't before. And if I press A and get my automation up, you can see that I can actually automate the volume here like you would do with any other track. What you want to do is you want to go right to the very end, and you want to really listen for that last chord, and you want to just fade it out naturally here. So if you can just have a listen here, see what I've done. I actually don't mind that little sloppy bit of guitar at the end there. I think it makes it kind of sound a bit punky. And just make sure it fades down to 0. You can obviously start it sooner. You can even add like a nice little gradual fade down like that, or just a regular slope. And then when you've done all of that, turn your little locator thing at the top, go to your mixer, click on BNC, and it should automatically detect your start and your end point. You can bounce it down offline and click OK. If you want to, you can bounce both at the same time, so it will bounce it down as a WAV and then at the end convert it to an MP3. So you click OK and it will bounce down the whole thing. And that's it. That's mastering in a nutshell. So if you go through from the start, you should be able to do this with your own track. But don't forget, let's just recap at the end. The EQ, I didn't even really go back and touch it because I was really happy with the brightness that was added by some of my other effects. I was just using it for this low cut. Your exciter, your saturation, and your tape emulation here, you can use them together, or you might not use any of them at all. You could just use a channel EQ, a multipressor, and a limiter, and your loudness meter should be about -14 at the end. And if it's too hot, you might need to roll it back a little bit on your multipressor. Hopefully that is going to make your track sound very good. And honestly, a properly mastered track just puts a big smile on your face. So I hope you have success with that. Yeah, good luck.